Do you still have the mic?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the part that we were talking about, the Senate Bill 360, and what Mr. Chapin mentioned about at some point concurrency when on the way of good development had a good intention, but the problem on this bill was the language, the way how it was written, and it really required interpretation. And I remember in my office everybody trying to really get it and say, what do they mean with this? And what we found out was like, this is open to any interpretation, and you can mislead it to do the wrong thing or take it to do the right thing. And that also comes to the point that when planners are reviewing a project from a developer, they need to have also a language that is clear and that is not prone to be taken to misinterpretations. So you can really stand your point when you're trying to protect the public interest and to get the best of those projects. And I think that's where the big problem is, that we don't really, the way how zoning is built, sometimes you have, in one city you have the old code, the new code, and the recently adopted code, and you have to go through all these codes to try to define one specific thing to defend your point when you are reviewing a plan. So I think that makes it complicated for everybody, and for anyone who is out of the profession makes it more complicated and more difficult to manage.
Definitely anybody moving forward with a plan in Florida, they need a planner. And it's the public that is left out.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one of the
Hello.
I've
been practicing this for a week. You all know. You can't handle the truth. So, I'm sitting here saying, my God, I've heard this before. And I really want to know if Tim's umbrage will still be around in 30 years, or whether we need new infrastructure. And this whole, so a bunch of notes. One, are there new roles for planners, and what might they be? Are we sort of stuck being local land use planners in a pre-John Forrester conception of the planner versus the developer? Is that all we're going to talk about? What makes you think that land use planning can address other issues which may be more important to the people of the state, like jobs or reducing greenhouse gases? How do you do that with land use planning? It's curious how the session sort of started with 3 speeches, and then it got to transportation concurrency, and we sort of forgot about climate change. We forgot about this notion of mega regions. And Rob, if he's here or not here, Florida will never become a 600-mile city. Get real. We might be a bunch of beads on a necklace, but we're not going to be a city. And so the question that there's a scale missing here between the local government and the state. And no one talked about metropolitan regions. I mean, Tim sort of talked about sub-state agencies, and he correctly indicated that the metropolitan planning organizations are not metropolitan in any sense other than the title. There's also something that nobody brought up about private infrastructure. We read Planning Magazine from October 2010, that's this year. There's a discussion about private roads. We are in fact doing private roads, aren't we, when we sort of put sun-pass lanes on roads. And we are in fact, sort of, there is a way to finance it without the sort of, oh my God, how do we finance it situation. We just don't think big enough, and we think it's too small. So there was another, oh yeah, here's my final comment. The final comment was, not only is the population of Florida getting older, I think the conceptual basis of this conversation is getting older. We need to sort of get younger. We need to get hip.
Okay, who wants to get hip?
But I think, David, that's really the thing. We don't think big enough. I can tell you why I didn't talk about regional bodies, because I don't think we have the regional body that can do the things that need to be done. And I think we need to think outside of the box and think about a different planning system, a system that actually takes care of the realities of today and not of something that existed in 1985 or in the 1970s. But I think we really need to think about planning in a different way. And, Tim said something that I thought was interesting. I think comprehensive plans made a difference. And to me, that's not good enough. I mean, is this all we can do as planners? I mean, creating the communities that we see and this, can we do better? Couldn't we actually create better communities that we actually like, where we have addressed some of these issues? We need to set the bar higher. And I think, part of this conference is, let's talk with journalists, let's talk with the media, let's talk with the press, let's try to figure out how we can do this better, how we can communicate with the public better, because something needs to be done. And I don't know how we're going to do this. I still don't know it, but I think starting a discussion about it with everybody is a good start.
Okay. I think those are wonderful questions. I think as a planners, we are, most of our planners, they dealing with the day-to-day job, reviewing development, and trying to answer questions from the city councils and things like that. So we sometimes forget what we actually should do. Is to think about long term, do a visionary planning, and we don't usually sometimes get our voice out and get a question asked and have a focal discussion point. That's, what do we want our region to look like? So I think that's something that in the early days of planning, in the 50s, 60s, we are doing a lot more than we are doing right now. It's doing some visionary thinking, future-oriented thinking, and really get the message out, get the community involved. What do you think 50 years from now? What do you want the community to be? We talk about that, but we really did not engage with the public, and we didn't engage the politicians. And sometimes we influenced by the politicians' short-term agenda to deal with day-to-day things. There are some very successful models of MPOs, but again, that also involves we need to give authority to the MPO. You can do lots of talking at the MPO level, but if we don't have any teeth to authorize MPO to do certain things, we cannot get anything done. There are very few successful MPO models. Portland Metro is one of the good ones, but they have real teeth. Okay, they plan, and you don't do things according to plan, you have a consequence. Think about it in Florida. We don't authorize any authority to the MPOs. So, and they don't get enough funding to even have enough staff to think about those issues.
Tim?
Sure. David, as always, provocative sort of responses. You asked about sort of what's the role moving ahead for planners, and my view is that planning has lost sight of what's in our title. We're not doing planning, we're doing permitting. We have our eyes on the desk, what's today, rather than our eyes on the horizon. And I'm desperate in trying to instill in my students, and I know these folks are doing the same thing in theirs, that your jobs is to look long term and to always be oriented to the long term. So every little decision matters for not just this decision, but for the next 50, 100 years or whatever. So I think we need to return to our visionary roots. If you go back to sort of the profession we look back on those days of Burnham and Olmsted and some of the other sort of precursors to planning. We talk about long-range thinking, and I think Zhong-Ren sort of captured that very nicely. So visionary, I think, is sort of needs to be brought back into the profession as one of our key roles. I'll get back to the land use and jobs here in a minute. You asked about sort of the user fee approach to paying for infrastructure, right? I get on a road and I pay a user fee. I turn on the tap and I draw out water and I pay a user fee. That works for a lot of our infrastructure systems, but I'm loath of a future in which when somebody wants to walk into a library, they have to pay a user fee. I'm loath of having to take my kids to a playground and somebody standing there and saying, before you can go in the gate, where's your dollar? Right? There are some infrastructure systems user fees work very well for, and others they don't. And I know you know this, but I mean, sort of, this model works very well for some things, but not for others. Although I do think for transportation, there's, if we got to actually pricing transportation correctly, we might see some interesting things happen. In terms of what can land use have to do with economic growth, I argue a lot. And I think that great evidence of that we can see out in Portland, out in Oregon, a state that 30 years ago was a struggling state, had an economy that was based on natural resource extraction, that had very little diversity in the economy, and that state made a big decision. And they said, that's not our future. We're going to turn a different way, and we're going to go down this very different high-tech path in which quality of life determines our future. And I would argue that in Florida that matters as much, if not more. What Florida offers to people who want to live here and who want to work here is, you don't see it today, but sunshine and beaches and wonderful water bodies and spectacular sunrises or sunsets, depending on which coast you're on. And if we develop a state in a way, or develop the state in a way that compromises that, that hurts our economy. So I actually think, instead we talk about growth management, I think if we reoriented towards sort of a quality growth rather than growth management. Quality growth is what we're after, with the idea being that that leads to economic development and contributes to economic development. That's the future of the state. So I actually think land decisions have a great connection to economic growth in the long run. Now, will it turn us around tomorrow? My guess is probably not, but we're planners. We're not about tomorrow, we're about 30 years from now. So that's sort of my riff on your take. And as far as getting hip again, let's find some celebrities that care about the future of the planet and educate them about planning. I think that would go a long way. If we could get Leo DiCaprio to sort of do a PSA in which he says planning's cool. My God, what a wonderful thing it would be for our profession.
Got planning?
Yeah, got planning. That's right. Very nice.
But I think going back to the sausage making, when planners have to do visionary, and municipal planners in particular, it's a matter of deciding the haves and have-nots. St. Lucie County, they tried to put together that huge area and say certain areas would not get construction, would not ever be developed, and those owners would be reimbursed in some manner by having a share of the profits from developing the other core areas, so a TDR type of approach. But you don't get municipal planners who are under politicians who are willing to stick their neck out and say, that guy should never ever have the right to develop, even though he's got property with property rights. So let's go to another question.
That was a very good point, and to follow up Jaap's comment, in the Friday presentation that we heard from Bernard Ziskovich when he was talking about planners, he said courage on the part of a planner is basically being willing to say that something is actually a fantasy and that it'll never happen. But it's interesting because we heard this morning the comment that the system is broken here in Florida and it needs to be fixed. If you really look at the system, it's not that the system is broken, it's the implementation is broken. If you take a look at the enabling legislation for states like California, Oregon, Maryland, Vermont, and you look at 9J5, you look at 163, all the sections we talked about this morning, on paper, it's probably the most comprehensive growth management, smart growth model that we have in the United States. It's really that that we're not implementing what we have. And one of the things that really needs to be done, you all talk about the limitations of finance. If in fact not the capital improvements budget, but the entire municipal budget was in fact directed at what's in the comprehensive plan, then you're talking about implementing the things that were identified as important to the community. But one of the other issues is nobody really wants the existing system that we have to work. The politicians don't want it because it limits discretion. Developers don't want it because the market changes. And the citizens don't want it because they want to be able to go with the flow and exercise their influence when it really affects them. And what's really kind of interesting is the planners are afraid to actually make the decision. They want to make the recommendation and leave to the politicians the decision. That's what we heard this morning. The planners are the advisors. For God's sakes, look at who the elected officials are. You have less qualification to be an elected official than you have to be a parent.